The effects of the war brought Russia to the brink of socio-economic collapse. At the moment, we see the former Soviet-era Russia in the most critical times of the war. Russia and its allies suffered a historic setback due to European economic sanctions as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Never before has it been so difficult for Russian President Vladimir Putin to wage war in Ukraine due to the severe economic restrictions imposed by Ukraine's allies. The Kremlin recklessly risks a massive uprising by Russian citizens, but it has every intention of continuing the conflict. The situation is extremely discouraging for the Russians. Millions of Russians are unemployed, and in major Russian cities such as Moscow and St. Petersburg, resistance and opposition to the regime are on the rise. Protesting Russian citizens, particularly wives and mothers, throng the streets of Moscow. This is a natural consequence of the war sanctions and Putin's irresponsible mobilization. And in his most recent statement, Russian President Vladimir Putin had no choice but to concede that the country's economy had suffered a severe hit. Russia's chaotic economic crisis raises a number of perplexing concerns. Is Russia disintegrating socio-economically? Let's promptly describe the Great Russian Uprising that was overshadowed by the war and economic collapse in Russia. Bogus unemployment reached record levels. The level of underemployment in Russian businesses has reached 5.2 million, surpassing the peak during the pandemic. With no job openings and no employees, the Russian labor market has collapsed due to the mobilization of the population. As a consequence of the sanctions, many restrictions were placed on Russian banks. The Russian people were cut off from international commerce. There has been no raise for retirees in the country, and their salaries are not compensated with mobilized soldiers. All of this indicates that a severe economic downturn is on the horizon in Russia, with severe repercussions for the Kremlin. Many nations, including the United States and the United Kingdom, impose severe sanctions on Russia, particularly Belgium, the United Kingdom, and the European Union. Sanctions that impede the Russian economy are on the agenda. The United Kingdom imposes the greatest number of sanctions on Russia. Japan and Australia have the least amount of sanctions. Correspondingly, the European Union on the other side imposed the greatest number of sanctions, 705. Switzerland was another nation that attracted attention with 774 sanctions. The Belgian government has set a new record with 250 billion euros in sequestered Russian assets, including those registered on the Belgian Euroclear platform. In this regard, the Russian government attempted to exert pressure on Belgium and the EU, but without success. In contrast, the most recent British sanctions targeted 130 Russian oligarchs with a combined net worth of $173 billion. The Kremlin was stunned by the greatest package of sanctions imposed by the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom was officially determined to economically isolate Russia. Dmitry Peskov, spokesman for the Kremlin, told reporters that the United Kingdom and other countries that imposed sanctions on Russian assets must lift them immediately and unconditionally. In a report published last week, Moscow stated that the country's economy contracted by 1.9% in the first quarter of 2023. Repo provided evidence supporting this allegation. This group continues to monitor Russia's economic situation second by second. In contrast, Western sanctions have had an unprecedentedly negative impact on the Russian economy, and Russia is presently facing a staggering $50 billion budget deficit. Economic measures and export restrictions appear to compel Russia to furnish its soldiers with household appliances. Alexander Prokopenko, a former official of the Russian Central Bank who fled the country shortly after the outbreak of the war, stated in a statement that the Russian economy had entered a protracted decline in response to the news that the country's youth had been sent to the front or fled. The labor force shrank. Putin's partial mobilization decision had a negative effect on the economy, and half of the business sector began to experience personnel issues. Since the pre-war era, Russia has been subjected to a total of 14,022 sanctions. Russia left Iran with this number of sanctions, Syria with this number, and North Korea with this number. On the other hand, its plan to collect income tax from the frozen assets of the Central Bank of the Russian Federation in the EU, it was previously reported. did that. European officials feared legal risks in case of a direct transfer of frozen Russian assets to Ukraine. Recall that Estonia was the first of the EU countries that planned to transfer the money of the Russian oligarchs to Ukraine. Estonian authorities have developed a system that allows Russians to sell their detained assets and send their proceeds to the Ukrainian side. Prolonged debates within the European Union regarding the mechanism to use frozen Russian assets in favor of Ukraine resulted in a specific plan that was tentatively supported by the leaders of European countries. The plan provides for the collection of income tax on frozen assets of the Central Bank of the Russian Federation. We are talking about creating a tax in excess of 200 billion euros on excess income from assets of the Central Bank of the Russian Federation. Interest and tax revenues, amounting to about 3 billion euros per year, will be transferred to the restoration of Ukraine. Most of the frozen Russian assets are in cash and deposits. The rest is in securities planned to be liquidated in the next 2 to 3 years. EU representatives have already discussed such a mechanism with the US presidential administration and have informed American allies about the progress in this regard. The leaders of European countries are considering the support of all G7 members. The agency also emphasizes that the plan in question can be challenged in court. Some sources claim that the interest and income plan to be received under this mechanism come from sanctions assets and ultimately belong to the Russian side. One of the interlocutors of the organization states that the issue of using the frozen assets of the Russian Federation is still difficult, as there is no mature proposal that can be accepted at the legislative level. In this direction, we can say that the Russian economy is heading towards a collapse that could overthrow the Putin regime. Analysts, on the other hand, calculated that a one-day war against Ukraine cost the Russian budget $1 billion. The Russian economy, despite the illusion of stability, is headed for a collapse that could topple the regime of Vladimir Putin. The one-day war against Ukraine cost the Russian budget $1 billion. The Kremlin is raising billions of dollars from raw material exports to finance the invasion. But since Western sanctions, Russia's energy prices have fallen and Russia is barely surviving by supplying the Asian market with heavily discounted oil. Against this background, the Russian authorities levy brutal taxes and rob their own people to continue the war in Ukraine. Such moves discredit Putin in Russian society and at the same time weaken his power. It is not surprising that neither the people nor the elite of the Russian Federation rallied around the Lord of the Kremlin during the attempted armed uprising organized by the Wagner PMC leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin. Analysts point out that losing wars goes hand in hand with economic turmoil and regime change in Russia. Although economic recession is rarely the only reason for an overthrow of power, it's emphasized that its serious importance in the overthrow of tyrannical regimes should not be ignored, especially in terms of financing the war. On the other hand, since the beginning of this year, the ruble has consistently weakened against the dollar and euro after abnormal prices in 2022. In recent days, the Russian currency has accelerated its decline against the backdrop of an armed insurgency in the Russian Federation. And even though the military coup attempt has been stopped, the ruble continues to fall slowly. The dollar traded on Moscow Stock Exchange exceeded 89 rubles and the euro exceeded 97 rubles. According to economic observers, the dollar may cost 100 rubles in the near future and later, even possibly 200 rubles, which seems quite realistic. The Russian treasury is starting to run into a shortage of money to fulfill all the government's promises. But with the new ruble rate, the treasury deficit does not seem so critical in this regard. The Russian authorities have no other means except for the devaluation of the Russian currency. Experts also remind that the large budget deficit in the Russian Federation ended with events similar to 1991 or 1998. That is, with a change of power. Therefore, all fiscal policy in Russia is aimed at maintaining balance by any means. In addition, the end of the tax period also puts pressure on the ruble on the last day. So how is Putin cannibalizing the Russian economy for personal survival? At the start of the 18th month of Russia's invasion of Ukraine amid last week's failed coup attempt, battlefield setbacks and global diplomatic condemnation, large Ukrainian hearts in a relatively small city were responsible for the complete and utter destruction of massive Russian forces. The outcome was very devastating for the Russian armed forces. The conflict in Volodar caused a tremendous amount of emotional suffering on both sides. The city has evolved into a fortress that even the most skilled Russian divisions are unable to breach. Enter the Kremlin. Commanders exhibited signs of fear. Because of this, scores of high-ranking commanders in the Russian forces decided not to participate in the battle. What was it exactly that made dozens of Russian commanders so terrified that they refused to battle against their own general's orders? The Russian troops attempted to take control of the city with the assistance of thousands of soldiers and hundreds of Russian armored vehicles and tanks. In order to protect the city, Ukrainian forces had a limited supply of both weapons and ammunition. Despite this, they were able to anticipate the movements of the Russian forces and put up a formidable defensive line using excellent strategy. Even though small drones, mine traps, and trenches may not appear to be particularly complicated when used at the right moment and in the right way, these strategies have been responsible for the destruction of at least 4 battalions of tanks and 2 elite brigades belonging to the Russian forces. The Russian commanders were overcome with a great deal of anxiety and dread. Bewilderment, anxiety, dread, and a profound sense of emptiness pervaded the scene after the deaths of thousands of soldiers and the destruction of dozens of armored vehicles in the span of a single day. It is highly likely that the soldiers and commanders who escaped the assaults following the crushing defeats sustained psychological injuries that would prevent them from ever participating in combat again after suffering significant casualties in a tank battle. Senior military officials from Russia decided against launching a fresh assault on the Ukrainian town of Volodar. Officials from the Ukrainian military have stated that the Russian brigade disobeyed the order to continue assaulting the city, citing the fact that defended Ukrainian positions, intimidated the leading brigade leaders and senior officers from the Russian army. Despite the fact that their incompetent commanders ordered them to initiate an attack, the Russian army commanders stationed on the field disobeyed those orders and did not go forward with the foolish attack. The Russian commanders were forced to withdraw in a helpless manner. The other day, as a result of the success of the Ukrainian forces, what led to the Russian soldiers mutinying and calling a halt to the assault on the strategic town. Let us now delve into the mysterious particulars of the conflicts. Since Putin's invasion, Ukraine has triumphed in one of its most significant conflicts in order to gain access to the primary rail link connecting eastern Ukraine, southern Ukraine, and the Crimean Peninsula. The Russian army is launching brutal assaults on the small coal mining town of Volodar, which is located approximately 150 kilometers, 93 miles southwest of Bakhmut. According to officials from the Ukrainian military, the conflict in the region featured the largest tank combat ever during the 3-week battle for the Volodar. The Ukrainian force was responsible for the destruction of at least 130 Russian tanks. This was a defeat that was extremely embarrassing for Vladimir Putin. During the course of a conflict that lasted for 3 weeks, Russian forces moved dozens of tank columns through a region close to Volodar in an effort to breach the Ukrainian lines. The Russians were shown to have been defeated in the footage that was captured by unmanned aerial vehicles for a period of 3 weeks. Drones flying above the battlefield recorded moment-by-moment footage of Ukrainian soldiers ambushing their enemies from a nearby wooded area. A formation of Russian tanks is attempting to reverse course in order to avoid being shot at by Ukrainian forces. Ukrainian troops were responsible for the destruction of Russian tanks, which were followed by the placement of lethal mines in the surrounding fields. During this conflict in which the Russians sustained significant casualties, a very embarrassing fact regarding the Russian forces came to light. According to the Ukrainian armed forces, heavy Russian casualties were caused by freshly recruited soldiers who lacked adequate training. This led to the Russian military. An injured medic who had been transferred to operate a tank was taken prisoner by Ukrainian troops. The results of this demonstrated that the experienced tank commanders employed by Russia were both incompetent and insufficient. It is abundantly obvious that the Russian soldiers who recently engaged in combat with the Ukrainian forces do not have a working knowledge of the ambush strategies that the Ukrainians have utilized throughout the conflict. As a result of the Russians deploying soldiers who lacked prior experience in battle. The question now is, how did the Ukrainian troops manage to accomplish this? According to Ukrainian Sergeant Linetsky, who fought in Volodar, they conducted an investigation to establish the routes that the Russian forces took by examining the roads that they traveled on. After that, the Ukrainian forces dispersed and hid while they awaited the arrival of the Russian troops. Lieutenant Vladislav Bajik, the deputy commander of the 1st Mechanized Battalion of Ukraine's 72nd Brigade, was one of the soldiers waiting in the ambush. He explained how they carried out devastating ambush strikes in an abandoned house near the front. According to Lieutenant Buyuk, they were able to identify the first column of approximately 15 tanks and armored personnel carriers, also known as APCs, as they approached them with the assistance of unmanned aerial vehicles. As soon as the Ukrainian battalion saw the Russian troops approaching, they launched an assault on the Russian soldiers. Because the Ukrainians were in the right place at the right time and were confident that they would accomplish their goal, they mined 2 fields that were connected by a safe dirt road, which resulted in Russian tanks being forced to slow down the assault as Russian forces approached the ambush set up by the Ukrainians. Soldiers awaited them deep in the woods. These soldiers were equipped with American infrared-guided javelins and Ukrainian laser-guided Stidnitsky portable anti-tank missiles. At the signal of they were waiting for the Russian forces, Lieutenant Valak, the commander of the Ukrainian brigade, started fire on the Russian column, forcing the soldiers in the column to hastily turn around and flee in the opposite direction. However, because the road was so congested, the Russian tanks were forced to circle around and head back to the minefields. Explosions were heard coming from Russian tanks as they approached the mined region. Tanks that were destroyed by Ukrainian forces acted as a barrier for tanks that were following the column, which delayed or halted the progression of the column. At this precise instant, Ukrainian artillery began firing, resulting in the destruction of additional armored vehicles. The Russian personnel who were attempting to escape from their ineffective tanks were eliminated by the Ukrainians. The countryside around Volodar was overrun with Russian troops. The region around Volodar is seen by Russian forces as a critical opportunity to achieve a substantial operational breakthrough on the battlefield. Because of this, it is possible that Russian forces will initiate a new assault in the region despite the risks involved. During the months of January and February, Volodar was the site of fierce fighting as Russian forces attempted to seize control of the town. It was stated by a Kremlin-appointed official that this has the potential to swing the war to Moscow's advantage. The commander of the Donetsk People's Republic, Denis Pushilin, emphasized that the capture of Volodar could significantly shift the power dynamic on the Ukrainian front. If you were to take possession of Volodar, you would have access to the Krasno armies as well as the Pokrovsky and Koya aspects of Russian troops and separatists supported by the Kremlin. The president of Ukraine, Vladimir Zelensky, has announced that his forces will not pull out of the battle for the industrial city of Beaumont. The United Kingdom's Ministry of Defense highlighted the likelihood that Russian assault planners are currently confronted with the choice of either attempting another Vardar offensive or supporting intense fighting to the north in the general vicinity of Bakhmut and Kreminna. As Moscow strives for its first major war triumph since the summer of 2022, fighting between Russian and Ukrainian troops around Bakhmut becomes increasingly intense. Since the beginning of the battle, the Russians have been unsuccessful in their attempts to seize Beaumont. However, despite having sufficient manpower and artillery to win the battle, they experience significant losses. Losses, particularly those brought on by the deployment of recently mobilized and inadequately trained personnel. On the other hand, there is yet another circumstance that places the Russian troops in a precarious position. You are aware that the Wagner PMC group, which is a mercenary contractor for the Russian army, is in charge of commanding the offensive activities of Russian forces operating in the Donetsk region. Yevgeny Prigozhin, a financier for Wagner PMC, recently made the statement that he is testing the limits of acceptable behavior and is soliciting support for the need to safeguard. In reference to the Russian Ministry of Defense, he mentioned our borders as well as reinforcements in his statement. We will be successful in obstructing the Ukrainian armed forces if everyone works together, pursues their goals with ambition, is picky and irritable, and conducts this operation. In addition to this, he warned that the Donetsk front would fall apart if Wagner's troops stopped providing assistance to Russia. Prigozhin also stated that if Wagner were to withdraw from Bakhmut at this time, the entire front would collapse. and the situation would not be very encouraging for any military formations that were tasked with safeguarding Russian interests. Russian President Vladimir Putin has been trying to restart offensive operations in Ukraine since the beginning of the year. However, due to manpower and ammunition problems, they cannot fully realize what they want. Despite the problems, Russian military units continue to exist on the eastern front line for Bakhmut. The crushing battle continues to intensify as Ukraine fends off attacks from the waves of fresh Russian troops trying to take over the eastern industrial city. The Kremlin focused on Bakhmut, which had a pre-war population of about 70,000, and where several highways and rail lines converge as a key point in President Vladimir Putin's goal of conquering the Donbass, the vital industrial and mining region that forms the easternmost part of Ukraine. As we all know, Bakhmut is at the center of a months-long, brutal war. After flattening most of the city with artillery shells, the Russians now seem to have surrounded the city on 3 sides and captured several towns and villages around it. In a statement, the Ukrainian army announced that street clashes started in both neighborhoods of Bakhmut. Russian forces continue their ground attacks to the north, east, and south of Bakhmut, but they still have not been able to besiege the city. In addition, Russian forces made marginal advances at Krasnaya, Gora, Zalizniak, and Stupka in the north of the city and to the southwest. It should also be noted that Moscow forces are within 2.5 miles of the Bakhmut-Sloviansk highway in the south. A few days ago, active fighting took place in the Bakhmut-Sloviansk highway area. Russian nationalist mill blogger Igor Girkin claimed that Russian forces had managed to take control of part of the highway from Bakhmut to the nearby city of Kramatorsk, just south of Sloviansk. However, the allegations were denied by the Ukrainian armed forces. The Ukrainian army controls 2 roads, one of which leads to Konstantinovka, the second to Chasiv. Also along this highway, in addition to the presence of the PMC Wagner Group, there was also a certain number of Ukrainian armored vehicles. Kiev military units aimed to attack the forces of the Russian PMC from the flank and thereby gain an advantage. The route was not used by the Ukrainian army for the transfer of reinforcements, but part of the army was evacuated throughout the city, including the previous units of the American PMC Mozart, which retreated from this direction. On the other hand, the Ukrainian army banned aid workers and civilians from entering Bakhmut. The Ukrainian military foresees that such a situation could be a very dangerous move as it could favor the invading Russian forces, and the Russian targeting of civilians would be a huge tactical gain and advantage. The Ukrainian military said it still holds the besieged eastern city, but the only main route it can use to send troops and supplies or evacuate the wounded is under Russian fire. Colonel Sergei Sharavathy, spokesperson for Ukraine's Eastern Military Command, said in an interview yesterday that Bakhmut is the epicenter of the enemy attack and therefore the situation is critical. Sharavathy added that Ukrainian troops have repelled 19 attacks on Bakhmut in the last 24 hours, but no milestone has been reached and the city is under Ukrainian control. Both sides are suffering massive human and equipment losses in Bakhmut. However, it is possible to say that Ukraine has so far been able to transfer reserves and supply from inside and to the north of the settlement. The city is now in ruins and the vast majority of its people have already fled. But Ukrainians have made Bakhmut a symbol of tenacious resistance and a rallying cry. And Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky has rejected any talk of abandoning it. Ukrainian forces also used Russia's relentless wave of attacks as an opportunity to inflict thousands of casualties. Military analysts say that the result is a massacre that is disproportionate to the strategic importance of the city. US officials estimate that around 200,000 fighters have been killed or wounded since Russia's invasion almost a year ago. That's a staggering loss compounded by the Bakhmut war. But the undeterred Kremlin recruited some 300,000 soldiers last fall and sent many of them to the Donbass. In July, the industrial city of Lysychansk, on an uplift overlooking the Seversky Donets River, fell under Russian control. It held out for a week after Russia captured the twin city of Severodonetsk across the river. As the anniversary of the invasion on February 24 approaches, Western analysts see the struggle for Bakhmut and its environs as the beginning or first stages of a new, broader Russian offensive, Hoping to fend off this attack and launch its own attack, Ukraine is begging the West for more powerful and modern weapons and faster delivery of those weapons. The Ukrainian Defense Contact Group, a US-led coalition of nearly 50 countries providing military aid to Ukraine, will meet in Brussels on Tuesday. Among the items is to be discussed is Kiev's call for warplanes. As we all know, on January 25, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz confirmed that Berlin will send 14 A-6 tanks to Ukraine and will allow third-party countries to supply main battle tanks to Kiev. Although President Joe Biden has announced that the U.S. will send 31 M1 Abrams tanks, it is expected that these will take months to arrive on the battlefield and the Ukrainian crews to complete the necessary training. Thereupon, Russia plans a rapid offensive before the Leopard tanks reach the battlefield. According to an operational update, Russia plans to launch a renewed offensive on Ukrainian forces in as little as a week before Western main battle tanks arrive in the war-torn country. Ukraine's defense minister, Oleksiy Reznikov, said at a press conference that Ukraine expects another major attack in the coming weeks because of the symbolism of such a move. But Russian nationalist voices expressed doubts that Russia could launch a successful offensive after the end of February. A military blogger associated with Wagner Group mercenaries fighting for Moscow stated that there is a limited time window to launch a large-scale offensive. Meanwhile, Ukrainian authorities are stepping up efforts to persuade several thousand civilians left behind in the face of an ongoing Russian offensive to leave Bakhmut. The city, which had a pre-war population of around 70,000, is constantly emptying as conflicts intensify. The head of the regional military administration, Pavlo Kirilenko, said less than 5,000 people were still there, including 140 children. Mr. Kirilenko stated in a national television broadcast that in another effort to reduce the number of civilians in the city, military authorities only allow people with special permits to return. After leaving, Mr. Kirilenko said that the army should focus on preparing the defensive lines in short months of conflict. Russian artillery strikes and fierce fighting ripped Bakhmut apart, cut off electricity and water, and made daily life virtually untenable for most civilians. Ukrainian authorities first ordered civilians to evacuate the surrounding Donetsk region last summer, and many of those who remain are elderly people whose health issues may make traveling difficult.